Anyone there? Hello? It's Wednesday night, night 5 of Bourbon and Scary Stories with yours truly. So check in if you're watching, tell us where you're from, city, state. If you're from out of country, let us know. And let us know what bourbon you're drinking. I've got my Old Forester again tonight, so getting ready to start. Hi Lori, hi Wendy, Mitzi, Ashley, Charles, Beth. Good to see y'all. I see Luis, Miguel. All right, well, time to go into the magic library. Okay, so I'm doing a different angle tonight. See how that works. And Kathy, hey Sean, Michelle, Joyce, glad you're joining us. So, night 5 of Bourbon and Scary yours truly. Hi Mike, hi Beth, hi Patty. My friend Luis Miguel in Mexico City called me out last night. He asked why I didn't take a shower and do my hair. He said I look like a slob. So I actually cleaned up for tonight. I did my hair. I'm wearing decent clothes. I splashed a little cologne on my face, so I'm all fresh and ready to go. I hope Miguel approves tonight. But like I said, if you're checking in, let people know where you're from, especially if you're from Louisville. Let all the locals know you're here. Mike says, I found my comb. Yep. Hey, Andrew. And I realized my little stand here is kind of wobbly. I better move this. All right, yeah. So if you're joining for the first time, this is Scary. And it looks like the connection's kind of off tonight. It keeps going on and out. Hi, all right, are we still there? I guess the connection isn't very strong tonight. It kind of cut out for a bit, so I moved to my normal location, so hopefully it'll be a little better. So, hey Vicky from Brownsville, Noah, Belinda, hi Allie, hey Matt. So like I was saying, night 5 of Bourbon and Scary Stories with yours truly. If you don't know who I am, my name's David Domine. I live in Louisville, Kentucky. Yeah, Beth said the spirits are messing with the feet. That's probably right. But so what we're doing is telling stories from my book, True Ghost Stories and Eerie Legends from America's Most Haunted Neighborhood. This is a recent book, which is a compilation of my first 3 books in the Ghosts of Old Louisville series. Ghosts of Old Louisville came out in 2005. A couple of years later, we had Phantoms of Old Louisville and the Pink Palace on the cover. That's going to be our second story tonight. And then the 3rd volume was Haunts of Old Louisville. And over the years, people got in touch with me. They shared more information about stories they had read in those previous 3 books. So I kind of took the most popular stories, I edited and updated it, and put them in this volume. So this is kind of the best of collection. So if you're looking for like the definitive ghost story collection for Old Louisville, this has most of them. And all the stories tonight and the previous nights come from this book. So I also do Louisville historic tours. We give evening ghost walks in the neighborhood from March 15th to November 15th. During the day, we do history and architecture tours. And since we're kind of all homebound, I decided to just tell the stories online. If I can't take people out and show them around, I'll do it virtually. So these are stories that if you come on one of my tours, you might see these places we've been talking about. So last night we talked about 2 haunted locations on 6th Street, the old Jenny Cassidy Free Infirmary for Women, and then we talk about Susan Shearer's house. And I noticed there's a lot of comments about the black and white photograph that the workers found at Susan's house. And when it disappeared, people asked if maybe it had gone back into the secret compartment, and no, that wasn't the case. Susan checked there, and it wasn't any place nearby. I found another picture of her house. This is a coffee table book I did a couple years ago. It's called Old Louisville, Exuberant, Elegant, and Alive. It's got 50 different homes in the neighborhood and mansions. You go inside, you see what they look like. And this is the mantle I was telling you about in Susan's house, where the secret compartment was. And if you see right here, this part right there, that protrudes from the front part, and it goes back like 8 inches, and all that area back there is storage space that's hidden. And on this side right here, that's where the workers found the spring-loaded secret door. And like I said, this area, it's like it's got enough storage space for like 3 or 4 shoe boxes end to end. And that's where Susan Shearer found that photograph of the little girl in the white dress, and after it disappeared, that's the apparition that started appearing in her house. So just wanted to show you that. But see a lot of people checking in. Hey, Chrissy, Jennifer, Anthony. Hey, Veronica, Kayla. So like I said, if you're just checking in, say hi to everyone. Let them know where you're from, what bourbon you're drinking tonight. And we're going to do 2 stories tonight. And the stories tonight focus on St. James Court. So if you're from Louisville, if you're from this area, if you've been to this area, you know that St. James Court is kind of the heart of Old Louisville. And once again, to recap, Old Louisville is one of the largest historic preservation districts in the country. Louisville, Kentucky's largest city, is really fortunate. Right near the downtown area, we have 45 square blocks of beautiful old homes. The houses tend to date from 1880 to 1900, 1905, so these are Victorian homes for the most part. They tend to be built of stone and brick. It's a beautiful neighborhood if you've never been. I came here in the 1990s to go to school. And I thought I was going to do my 1 year and leave, and I had no desire to come to Louisville, Kentucky, but I was blown away by the neighborhood, the friendly people. Kentucky is a great state, and I never left. So Louisville is my home. I love the city, and I especially love Old Louisville, this great neighborhood with all these wonderful old houses. So given that these houses have been around over 120 years on average, they've seen some history. Back in the day, you didn't go to the hospital. Often the doctors came to your house. Your body was laid out in the front parlor after you languished away on your deathbed. So these houses have seen some activity. People, just like today, they went crazy. They killed each other. They killed themselves. They fell in love with people who didn't love them back. They went bankrupt. All these things kind of left their marks on these houses. And in recent years, the houses in Old Louisville have been giving up their stories. And so many stories have been surfacing from these 40 roughly square blocks of Victorian houses that it's earned us the nickname as America's most haunted neighborhood, because they say you can't go more than half a block without there being a reportedly haunted house in Old Louisville. So tonight, like I said, our 2 houses are on St. James Court. So St. James Court for years was the #1 address in the city. If you go to St. James Court, there's a huge grassy boulevard that goes down the center. Thanks, Nancy. Hey, Jeremiah, Allie. And there's a fountain at the center, the fountain at St. James Court, which is kind of the symbol of the neighborhood. But there's 2 landmarks on St. James Court. One of them is the Pink Palace, which we'll talk about in a bit. That anchors the south end of the court. And then the other is the famous Conrad's Castle. And if you haven't seen Conrad's Castle, it's one of the most impressive houses in the city. Here's a picture of it in that coffee table book I was telling you about. This was built in the mid-1890s. It's a great example of Richardsonian Romanesque architecture. It's built of local limestone. And it was built as a single-family residence. But today it's a museum. And I see Christopher's on here. Christopher is one of the people in charge of the house. So when things calm down and you're able to go down to Old Louisville, to St. James Court, make sure you take a tour of Conrad's Castle, today the Conrad Caldwell House Museum, and support them. It's a beautiful place. And it's actually the only place in the neighborhood of these 40 square blocks that you can actually tour. It's set up as a historic house. It's been a historic homes museum since the 1980s. And if you take a tour, like I say, I highly recommend a tour, you have to be careful because they say it's haunted. So if you're fans of ghost hunters have spent some time. They spent 2 weekends here several years back. They've made some interesting discoveries. But the last I've heard, this place is haunted by 6 different entities. And back when I was researching my first book, Ghosts of Old Louisville, I talked to the previous director. Her name was Elizabeth. She told me some interesting stories. And then Deb Ryle, who was a Facebook friend, that's how I got to meet her. She told me some interesting stories from her time there when she was the director. And the apparitions are just totally different, and they inhabit different parts of the house. Supposedly, the ghost of one of the Caldwells, they were the second owners of the mansion. Grace Caldwell, whose portrait hangs in the front parlor, she communicated with former residents during kind of a seance one night. There is the ghost of a former housekeeper. Hey, Linda. Linda is with the Conrad Caldwell house as well, so hey, say hi to her. But often on the stairs, things have happened. One night, someone was closing up the place. This was in the 1990s, and a storm was brewing. Rain started pouring, and the person who was closing up heard someone on the stairs say, the windows, and they ran and looked, and one of the big windows was open. So she closed it right in time because all this rain was pouring in. It could have damaged all the great wonderful woodwork there. And she closed the windows, and she realized there was no one else in the building. And she talked to people who worked there, and other people had experienced things like this. And they think it's one of the old housekeepers that used to work there. For a time, after World War II, it became the Rosanna Hughes Retirement Home for Presbyterian ladies. So another apparition that's been reported is a group apparition. It's like 3 old ladies kind of always in a group that is seen in different parts of the house. And, several other apparitions as well. But the one that I always hear about is an apparition that tends to appear to people like me. And by people like me, I just don't mean people who like old houses and scary stuff. I mean people who, when they sign up for one of the tours at the Conrad Caldwell House, and they're told not to wander off and not to leave the group and not to try to open doors that are locked or go into rooms that are off limits. So nosy people, they're the ones that have these strange encounters, and it's always the same thing. Someone will wander off from the group. They'll be snooping around in the house where they shouldn't be, and out of nowhere, an apparition appears. It's a short little man. He looks to be dressed in attire from the 1890s, a brown tweed suit. He has a kind of a bowler hat on his head and a goatee. And the thing is, he never says anything. He just looks at these people. He kind of confronts them, and he looks at them sternly, and then he does this, as if to say, you shouldn't be doing this. He kind of scolds them, and then he disappears. Well, over the years, I have talked to like a dozen people who have gotten in touch with me, and they swear they've seen this apparition. Most of them were around 2000, 2003, when I was doing the bulk of my research for my first book. And these people always had the same experiences. It was always that same description of the little man with the goatee, the bowler hat, the tweed suit. Always those same circumstances. They had kind of wandered off. They were someplace where they shouldn't be. And always, these people reported at the end of the tour, they were kind of startled when they looked over, and on a far wall, they saw an oil portrait hanging on the wall. It was of a man in a brown tweed suit with a goatee and a bowler hat, and they invariably exclaimed, "Oh, that's the man we just saw." And the docents then were kind of used to it. They said, well, that's, Mr. Conrad. He's the man that built the mansion. So Mr. Conrad came from France. He came from Strasbourg. He ended up in Louisville right before the Civil War broke out. He had apprenticed as a leather tanner. He arrived in New Orleans, made his way up the Mississippi to Louisville. They say he arrived with only $2 in his pocket, but by the end of the century, he was one of the wealthiest men in the city. And all of this was made from things like saddles and boots and harnesses. You know, leather items back then were just indispensable. So he only lived there for 10 years. Mr. Conrad died on the stairs. He was going to his office one day in 1905. He had a heart attack and died. Okay. So the thing is, these people, they hear the stories from the docents, and, you know, that's that. No one really knows much else. But what I've discovered over the years is that a lot of the Conrad descendants are still in town. Mr. Conrad's great-grandchildren have come on tours with me, and they've heard the stories about his alleged hauntings. And when they hear the stories of his hauntings, none of them is ever surprised, because they said their ancestor, Mr. Conrad, was kind of the neighborhood curmudgeon. He wasn't the friendliest of persons, they say. He was kind of grumpy. He was kind of stingy, from what people say. Back in the day, he paid his workers like half of what the going wage was, and supposedly bragged about it to his friends afterwards. But they said Mr. Conrad was notoriously short, and he had a habit of often looking up to people he was talking to, and often he was doing this, kind of scolding them. So they think that this ghost that haunts the Conrad Caldwell house, the short little man, is probably the ghost of Mr. Conrad. And, you know, there's 5 other entities who co-haunt the place with him. They think, you know, he's probably trying to keep them in line. And then, of course, he's got lots of people traipsing through, you know, because the Conrad Caldwell house is open for tours 5 days a week generally. So he's probably letting people know that he's still in charge. So if you get a chance, check out the Conrad Caldwell house and support them. It's a beautiful place. Like I said, it's the only place in the neighborhood that's open for regular tours. And it's a great example of late Victorian, early Edwardian design. And if you do take a tour, make sure the first chance you get, you wander off from the group, try to open doors that are locked where you shouldn't be, try to open drawers and cupboards and snoop around. And if anyone appears and does this, like Mr. Conrad used to do, make sure you let me know, because that's how I get a lot of my information. People contact me, they tell me about their encounters, and if I think they're credible, that leads to me talking to them, doing research, and like I said before, 9 times out of 10, I find something in the past of these houses or something in the historical record that kind of puts a face on the modern day hauntings. So that's the beautiful Conrad Caldwell house. So if you get a chance, go on Facebook, like their page, support them. Make sure you plan a tour there when things calm down and we're able to get out and about. Okay? So that was our Conrad Caldwell house. Down on the other end of the block, like I said, that's our famous Pink Palace. And I pointed out the Pink Palace is the house on the cover of my second book, Phantoms of Old Louisville. And it's a famous landmark. When you're painted Pepto-Bismol pink, you kind of stand out. So everyone in the city knows what the Pink Palace is. And when we have our famous St. James Court Art Show, which is every first weekend in October, tens of thousands of people go down for this, which is one of the best and largest and oldest art shows in the country. It's been going on since the 1950s, and often people will say, meet me in front of the Pink House, and what they're talking about is our Pink Palace. So if you're ever down on St. James Court, you won't miss Conrad Caldwell, the house, and you won't miss the Pink Palace. Okay, so VG says she loves Pepto-Bismol pink. And by the way, if you see VG Evers and Thomas Evers popping up on the feed, they're the current owners of the Pink Palace. They just moved in the fall, so they're learning all about their famous house. And I don't know if they've had any weird activity yet, but I hope they'll let us know if they do. But in case you need a current image, that's the Pink Palace, which is in my book, True Ghost Stories, Old Louisville, Exuberant, Elegant, and Alive, the kind of design and architecture book I did a few years ago. And that's a beautiful place. They got one of the best backyards in the neighborhood. Got an in-ground pool back there, and a much larger backyard that you would think. But it's a single-family house today, the Pink Palace. It wasn't always a single-family house, though. So many people say that this was one of the very first houses built on St. James Court in Old Louisville. And if you know anything about Old Louisville, if you've heard some of the other stories I've told, Old Louisville back in the day was outside the city limits. What happened was in 1883, the city hosted something called the Southern Exposition. It was a kind of early World's Fair, and where today St. James Court is, that is where they built this massive wooden building. It opened on August 1st, 1883. It measured 600 by 900 square feet. They said it was the largest wooden building in the world at the time. And this World's Fair was only supposed to last for 100 days, but it ended up closing 5 years later. During that time, the city jumped from like 110 to 270,000 people. It put Louisville on the map, and all these people moving to Louisville because of the job opportunities, the opportunities afforded by the Southern Exposition. They moved to the city. Oh, I see Ken Parks, the Stick Witch from a couple years ago. Good to see you, Ken. And what happened is there was such a building boom, they needed places for all these people moving there. So the area that is today Old Louisville was developed kind of as a city's first suburb. It was the only place they had land where they could build new houses. And to give you an idea of how fast the city was growing, they say in 1885, at the height of the Southern Exposition, on 3rd Street, the old Millionaires Road, they built 250 mansions just in 1 year. That's how fast the city was growing. So the Southern Exposition building that stood there was a wooden structure. It was torn down in the late 1880s. And when they tore it down, left kind of a big empty footprint in the middle of all this ongoing construction in the neighborhood. So a developer, William Slaughter, who we talked about last night in Susan Shearer's house, he bought these roughly 6 square blocks and decided to put a residential enclave there that was modeled after London neighborhoods, and it was called St. James Court, after the court of St. James in London. The beautiful walking court that kind of cuts through was called Belgravia Court, after Belgravia in London. And so, as I said, for many years, this was one of the #1 addresses in the city, and one of the first places that was built there was today's famous Pink Palace. So it wasn't always pink, though, and it wasn't always a single-family house. So it was built around 1890, 1891. The history is a little murky because in the 1937 flood in Louisville, a lot of the courthouse documents were destroyed. So sometimes it's hard to find records that we need to substantiate these stories. But it is a single-family house today, but it wasn't always a single-family house. After World War II, many of the houses in Old Louisville were turned into apartments and rooming houses. Probably 80% of them, they think, at one time in the 60s, the 70s, at the height of urban renewal, they were turned into apartments and rooming houses. And that's what happened with the Pink Palace for a time. So it was in the 1960s, though, the years after World War II, when it acquired a reputation for being a haunted place. So the Pink Palace is haunted by someone the locals call Avery. And in the paranormal world, Avery is what's known as a crisis apparition. And they say a crisis apparition is a spirit that turns up in times of danger. It's an entity that manifests itself as either someone who's in distress, is kind of sending out energy, and it's making contact to let people know that they need help, or else it's showing up at a time when someone else needs help. And Avery, as people who've lived there in the past have reported, has always showed up in times when something bad was about to happen. So he's kind of a harbinger. He shows up to kind of warn people that something bad is about to happen. So if you have to have a ghost in your house, a crisis apparition is what you want. He's kind of like a built-in alarm. Avery is always described the same way. He's an aristocratic Southern gentleman, has a mane of wild white hair, and he always dresses in a white duck suit. And if you don't know what a duck suit is, think of Colonel Sanders. That white suit with the string tie, that was Avery's typical attire. They think every time he's appeared, he's always been wearing that white kind of suit. And as far as we can tell, Avery was first, substantiated or documented back in the 1960s when the place was turned into apartments. So in the basement apartment, there was a tenant by the name of Jenny, and I run into her every now and then. She told me the story at the St. James Court Art Show when I was signing my first book years ago. And she, for a couple years, while she was studying at the University of Louisville to be a library scientist, she occupied the basement apartment. And Jenny, I still talk to her. She's a very practical woman. She's the kind that said she never, ever would have believed in ghosts until she saw one for herself one night. And what she said happened was it was a cold December night, like 1968, 1969. She was in her last year of studies, and she was on Christmas break. And it was a Saturday night. She was in her apartment. She was in the kitchen baking cookies to take to a Christmas party. And she only had one tray of cookies left. She reached down, opened the oven door to take out this tray of cookies, and as she bent over, she said, despite all the heat and the hot air radiating up from the oven, she said all of a sudden she had a very, very strange feeling because the room turned icy cold. And Jenny slowly stood up. She put the cookies on the counter, and she realized she could see her breath puffing out in the air in front of her. And that's when she felt like a cold wind kind of blow at the surface of her back. And all of a sudden, she had the odd sensation that she wasn't alone in the kitchen. And so she turned her head to the side, and 2 feet away, she said she saw this man standing there. A tall man, aristocratic looking, white hair, in a white duck suit, just standing there and staring at her intently. Well, right away, Jenny knew she had to be seeing a ghost because she could see through him to the cabinets on the other side. But, Jenny had never seen a ghost before, so she probably didn't know what the protocol was. Do you scream? Do you faint? Do you run away? Do you offer it a cookie? Before Jenny could react, she said all of a sudden the ghost faded away and disappeared. And that's when she heard a voice say, "My name is Avery." And Jenny said when she heard the ghost identify himself, all of a sudden she wasn't afraid. She knew he wasn't there to harm her. Nonetheless, she was kind of bothered. She was disconcerted. She had had a paranormal experience. She didn't know what to do. She thought about calling a friend and telling her what had happened, but she decided against that because her friend was the kind that would make fun of her. So Jenny just resigned herself to the fact that she had had a paranormal experience, and she said she was never going to tell anyone about this. She was kind of afraid that people would make fun of her, so she just kept it to herself. Well, an hour later, Jenny had calmed down, and she looked at her watch, and it was getting time to go to the party. She had an hour to go before the party started, so she decided to take a bath and get ready. And down in the corner room right below the turret is where her bathroom was, and she had one of those big Victorian cast iron clawfoot bathtubs. She filled it up with hot water, put in bubble bath, and decided to jump in and kind of soak for a bit, before she got ready. And that sounds fine and good to me, except Jenny did something I wouldn't have done had I just seen a ghost. She turned off all the lights in her bathroom and lit a candle. So there she lay in the hot soapy water, in the dark basically. There was just the solitary candle nearby flickering. And of course, she started to relax. She grew drowsy. Her eyelids grew heavy. And she thought she was about to doze off to sleep when all of a sudden she realized the room was freezing cold. And she opened her eyes wide, and she could see her breath kind of hanging in the air in front of her. and all of a sudden she felt like a cold wind ripple across the surface of the bath water. And that's when Jenny had the odd feeling that someone was in the room with her. So she turned her head to the side, and who was there standing right next to the bathtub? Any guesses? Yes, it was Avery in his white suit, just standing there, intently staring at her like he had before. He was kind of shimmering, and once again she could see through him, and she could see the wall and the shelves behind him. And this time it really freaked her out. She shrieked, she jumped up from the bathtub, threw on a bathrobe, and covered herself. But she said as soon as she pulled her foot from the hot water, all of a sudden there was a terrible crashing noise, and something came flying through the air. And it landed in the bathtub, and the water splashed up all over her. The bathtub broke into pieces and fell apart on the floor. And that's when Jenny saw that one of the nearby windows was broken out. She didn't know what to do, so she ran. She got the phone and called the police. And minutes later, the police arrived. And when they arrived, the police interrupted a burglary in progress, it turns out. It turns out that Saturday night in December in 1968, 1969, whenever it was, there were two burglars nearby, and they were crouched down across the street. They were behind some hedges, and I guess they were kind of casing the joint. They had been watching as one by one the lights would go out in the different apartments in the Pink Palace. And, it was Saturday night, 1960s. People were going out and have fun. Saturday night was the night to go out and dance and go to bars and go out to eat and things like that. So the burglars, they had been there all night. They were watching as one by one the apartments went dark. Well, when Jenny turned off her bathroom light when she jumped in the tub, that, it turns out, was the very last light to go out in the Pink Palace. And when the burglars saw her light go out, they assumed that the Pink Palace was empty. And so one of them had found a big chunk of broken sidewalk nearby, like a slab of concrete, like 3 by 4 feet. And he picked up the slab of concrete and he walked over and threw it through the nearest window as a way of breaking in. And whose window was that? Of course, it was Jenny's bathroom window. And where did it land? Exactly, it landed in her bathtub in the very spot where her head was resting. And Jenny said had she not gotten out of the tub just a couple seconds before, she said she would have been killed because this big piece of cement landed in the very spot in the bathtub where her head has been resting. She said afterwards she was able to find the pieces of the tub, and she saw the one part like where the concrete made contact. Definitely it was where her head was. She said she would have been killed. So yes, Sophia, Avery saved her. And the thing is, even then, Jenny didn't tell anyone what had happened because she was afraid they'd make fun of her. She didn't think anyone would believe her. So the following spring, she graduated from the university. She got her degree, and she moved to California. Hey, Rebecca. And she got a job at a library, and she was there working for years. Well, as fate would have it, she moved back to Louisville in the late 1990s. She got a job at the library downtown. And she was living in the Highlands back then, but she said she always remembered her days in old Louisville. She always had a fondness for old Louisville. But she said one day she was at work and there was like an old storage room they had to clean out. And she was moving some boxes around and she came across this big cardboard box that was full of old files of newspaper articles, like clippings. And what they had done is they had like a old black construction paper, and they cut out these old newspaper articles and glued them to these pieces of black construction paper. So each file was full of all these old articles, but each file was about a different neighborhood. There was one for the Highlands, there was one for Crescent Hill, there was one for the South End, the West End, and the very top file she saw said Old Louisville, St. James Court. Well, she had lived there, so she wanted to see what was in it, so she opened up this file of old newspaper articles glued to construction paper, And the very top article caught her eye because there was a black and white photograph in the article. And guess what it was? It was the Pink Palace. She, from the iconic tower and the turret, she recognized it right away. So she pulled out this article and started to read. And the article was from 1896 from the Louisville Times, which isn't around anymore. And it was about the family that had just moved in to what is today the Pink Palace. It turns out this article was kind of talking about some challenges the family was facing because it was rumored that that house had been a brothel for a time. And that's kind of one of the local legends, that the Pink Palace was a brothel. There's a lot of dispute about that. But at one time, the plans were to turn it into something known as the St. James Court Gentlemen's Club and Casino. So it's kind of dubious that there would have been a brothel on St. James Court. You know, that was a respectable neighborhood. And anyway, the brothels back then would have been down along the river. And so we're not quite sure if that ever happened, but supposedly the family had to deal with the tarnished reputation that the house had earned because there were rumors that it had been a brothel at one time. Well, Jenny, when she read this, she thought this was really funny, but she stopped chuckling when she turned to the next page of the article because there she found another photograph, a black and white photograph waiting for her. And it wasn't of a building this time, it was of a person. And it was a man who was tall and stately, very aristocratic. He had a wild mane of white hair, and he was wearing a white duck suit. All of a sudden, Jenny realized the man she had seen all those years before was staring out at her like he had stared at her that night many, many years before. And then she read the caption underneath, and the caption said, "Mr. Avery and his family have recently acquired the Old Gentleman's Club, and they will call it home from now on." So it turns out there really was an Avery. So that is when Jenny finally told her story. She had read one of my books, early books about the ghosts in Old Louisville. And so when she found this, she got in touch with me and asked if I would help her find out more about today's Pink Palace. So I met her one day. We went down to the library and had lunch, and then I took her to the courthouse, and I showed her how to pull up property deeds, which can be a very time-consuming process. And we got the deeds all the way back to the original owners, to the first family that lived there. And sure enough, the first family to live there was the family of Benjamin Franklin Avery. And when my friends Jeff and Kent lived in the Pink Palace, I gave them the deeds, so they had all this stuff. But Avery's family, just like Mr. Conrad's family, is still in town today. The B.F. Avery Farm Manufacturing and the B.F. Avery Farm Manufacturing and Machinery Company is still around today. And his family, his great-grandchildren, have come on tours with me as well. And Avery's descendants have told me a lot about him. Avery, fortunately, was like the opposite of Mr. Conrad. He wasn't a neighborhood curmudgeon. He was like the neighborhood gentleman. Everyone loved Avery. He and his wife were pillars of the community. If you go to the Women's Club on 4th Street, there's a historical marker dedicated to her. She was a famous suffragette. She would have meetings in what is today the Pink Palace. Unfortunately, she died before women got the right to vote. And being the 100th year anniversary this year, we're talking a lot more about women like Mrs. Avery. But what people remembered about Avery, aside from the fact that he was just a good neighbor, a good guy, they always remembered that he would wear, a white duck suit at least half the year. That was his preferred attire. And every night after dinner, he would stroll the court twice. That was his evening ritual. And they also said everyone remembered how much he loved his home and family and how protective he was of his house and property. So people think that the ghost of old Avery is still lingering there today, kind of to watch out for people who reside in his old place, today's famous Pink Palace. So as far as I know, Thomas and VG Evers, haven't seen him yet, but I've talked to previous owners, and they had strange encounters as well. And it was always that kind of situation where he would turn up right before something bad happened. He was kind of like there to warn them. There was a fire that broke out one night, and the people living there, they saw him on the stairs, and supposedly it was that spot on the stairs where the fire broke out just a minute or two later. And since they were there, they saw the fire and they were able to put it out. But I've talked to 3 or 4 of the previous occupants who had strange stories to report, and all of them involved the specter of a man in a white duck suit that fits the description of Mr. Avery. So that's the ghost of our famous Pink Palace. So if Thomas and VG see anything, I hope they let us know. But those 2 stories, the Conrad Caldwell House and the ghost of Mr. Avery at the Pink Palace, are probably our 2 most famous stories on St. James Court. There's actually another one called the Ice Boy, and I'll tell you that another night. So tomorrow night we'll tune in. We'll have volume 6, episode 6 of our stories. And like I said, I've probably got 10 nights of stories I can milk out of my book, True Ghost Stories and Eerie Legends from America's Most Haunted Neighborhood. When that runs out, I'm just going to read from my memoir, Voodoo Days at La Casa Fabulosa, which is my 12th book, my most recent book, and it's about the house I lived in on 3rd Street, the old Widmer house. Josh and Sarah Wade live there now. They've been tuning in for these stories, and was there for 8 years. Our Thursday night, Monday night, Tuesday night dinner club would meet every week, and bought the house and moved in having heard that it was allegedly haunted, but I'm kind of a skeptic myself, so I didn't really think too much of it. Bought the house and moved in, and sure enough, all these weird things started to happen. But even though I had some creepy experiences, what I discovered, it was the real life characters in the neighborhood that was the most fascinating part of my time in the Casa Fabulosa, as it became known, the fabulous house. So tune in tomorrow night, and we'll hear some more stories. And like I said, coming up in maybe 2 or 3 nights, I'll tell the story of the house in old Louisville. And that is the subject of my current book project. It's a true crime book about a house at 1435 South 4th Street. It's right across from where the Lady Ross house stands. And I told that story a couple nights ago. But the evening of June 17th, 2010, the police were called to this house. It was a domestic dispute. They thought that was it, but things kind of escalated, and it ended up with them bringing in a posse and going down into the old wine cellar and digging it up, and there they found the body of James Carroll buried in a blue Rubbermaid container. And it led to the most scandalous trials we've seen in Louisville in a long time, the trials of Jeffrey Munt and his ex-boyfriend at the time, Joey Banis, and I sat in on those trials and made a lot of interesting discoveries. It turns out not just a murder happened in that house. The house at one time was a sanatorium. It was haunted, they say, back in the 1920s. Other deaths have been documented there, other interesting characters living in the house. The guys who were living there were not only accused of murder. At the time they were arrested, they were out on bond for counterfeiting money. There's a lot of twists and turns to this story, and I'm working on the book, trying to finish it up. My agent, Alice Spielberg, is talking to publishers, so hopefully soon you're able to see it on the shelves, but I got to do a little work and finish it first. But I still love talking about it. Every week, every month, I find out something interesting about this story. So stay tuned, because in a couple nights I'm going to tell you everything I know about the house in old Louisville, the old Richard Robinson house. And that'll probably be a good hour right there. If any of you are in old Louisville, you might know David Williams. He used to work at the visitor center in the park. But David is a neighborhood writer. He wrote a book about secrets of old Louisville. He used to write for newspapers. He he's one of the people that knows, every little nook and cranny of the neighborhood, and he did a lot of house researches. So he found some really interesting information about the house in Old Louisville. I was able to use some of his research to help find out more about the house itself. But if you get a chance, check out his book. And we're trying to keep it local, so when things wind down, plan on coming to see us. Our daytime tours will start from Adrian's Cafe at the corner of 4th and Oak. My friend Carrie Sweet, she does a lot of great design work. Sean Stafford, my friend and a student of mine actually, he has Huntley Media. He's been redoing our website, LouisvilleHistoricTours.com, working on getting that up and running. We're working on getting a line of merchandise and stuff because what this is all about is trying to spread the word about Old Louisville. You talk about Victorian homes, great architecture. A lot of people don't really know much about Old Louisville. But you go to Old Louisville, you'll understand what all the excitement is all about. We got just block after block after block of beautiful old houses. And it's an incredible neighborhood. They say we've got what it takes to compete with places like Charleston and the French Quarter and the Garden District in New Orleans, Savannah. And I take thousands of people around on tours, and it's very rare that I don't find someone bowled away by the neighborhood like I was the first time I moved here. So thanks for coming out tonight. So time to turn in. Have a last swig of bourbon. I hope you have a great evening. It was great to see you all again. Like I said, I didn't know how this was going to turn out, but it's turning out to be a highlight of my day, to look forward to meeting you all and seeing you at 9 o'clock and telling stories. And we're all in this for the long haul, so I hope you're all staying healthy. And, we're all going a little stir crazy, so I hope that me getting on Facebook Live and sharing some stories helps you pass the time. I know seeing you all and hearing your comments helps me pass the time. It gives me something to look forward to. So hang in there and stay healthy, stay positive, and I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow night. If you can, tell your friends about it. Invite a couple people. If we can get the numbers up every night, that would be really great. The more people we have learning about Old Louisville and our ghosts, the better. So thanks for Christopher Kirkland and the others at the Conrad Caldwell House. I hope when things are better, you get lots of people coming for tours. And Tom and Viji, thanks for checking in tonight and hearing a little more about your old house. Like I said, if something happens, anything weird happens, let me know, because I love getting more information and fleshing out these stories. So thank you all. It was a great night. And thanks to my friend Tim Pardue. I think I mentioned this before. He gave me the world's best flask. So it's not one of those little measly hip flasks that only has like a couple swallows. This will keep me going all night. So this is my favorite thing in my magic library. So thanks, Tim. And I think in a couple days I might have to actually cut my own bangs. So my hair is not standing up no matter how much gel or glue I put in it. So who knows, in a couple nights I might have a different look, or I might have to get Ramon to cut my hair. So take care, everyone. Good seeing you, and good night. Love you all. Bye.